could split a lot of hairs, hip-hop and rap especially, because rap is a vocal style.
Everyone knows what rock and roll is. It's a very large umbrella. It covers a whole bunch of stuff.
Could you say that the Gaga gimmick was an afterthought? You know, like she had the songs, but they said, nah, you need more.
She's definitely one that has the talent.
Yeah.
Can write, can do singing, songwriting.
We started coming out to the West Coast in the early 80s. We saw Kennedy's Black Flag, flipping all this, really nihilistic punk rock thing. Man, there's a lot of rules in this thing. You gotta wear this chain that way, and you gotta hate this particular kind of politics. It was just like all these rules, and we're like, what are these rules about? We want to make music. Music.
I was ready to be born ready.
Oh, yes. Sounds a bit like rock and roll, doesn't it?
10 seconds, guys.
From Mind Rocket Studio, between Ohio and Pennsylvania, covering the culture of popular music of yesterday and today. Speaking of music, you're listening to it. With your hosts, from the Raw Alternative, Rick Polo, from SYLM, Joe Sinkovich, and Lucas Golub. Here's your anchor, Jimmy Martin.
Welcome to the Speaking of Music show. With us today is Mr. Rick Polo and Mr. Lucas Golub. Our good buddy Joe is on an indefinite sabbatical, so he won't be joining us this episode, but who knows what will happen in the future. On the episode today, we posed a question to some of our social media friends, and we asked, do you miss the B-side? Whether you were a record collector, a cassette collector, or both, there was a phenomena about the first song on Side B, and even how Side B compared to Side A. We expanded the question to include just the whole concept of physical, tangible music media and how it compares to the intangible digital file that's you can't see, but it's on your computer. And we don't want to be tagged as a curmudgeon or brand ourselves as old fogies who aren't down with MP3s, because that's not the case. I think, though, it is worth just discussing the differences between an album or a cassette or even a CD that you can hold in your hand, you can pull out the sleeve and read the credits and read the lyrics or the liner notes. And it's something that, you can hold on to. And with that comes all of the things that came with having that piece of wax in your hand and that square piece of cardboard, and having to deal with the limitations of the technology of that time. So before we get into it, I thought we would play a clip that came in from a good friend of mine, Jimmy Taylor, who played drums for the band Pegasus and Mellow Crash. And he's quite an historian, not only in the topic of beer, but in the topic of music. So he kind of gave us a little bit of a setup and gave us the history on vinyl and added in his thoughts. So let's listen to Jimmy Taylor.
Well, in the beginning, the first recorded music, or any recorded sounds, were put on aluminum cylinders, which were turned on a crank, and you can cut in your own recorded sounds with a magnetic stylus. These were popular up to the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. But by 1910, they had developed the first shellac disc. It was not made of vinyl, they were made of shellac. It was a 10-inch, 75 RPM single. And they were limited to less than 4 minutes, usually 3 to 4 minutes per side. And these were the first singles that were sold for commercial music, recorded music in people's homes in the early 1900s. These did not work quite so well for long symphonic pieces, which got cut up into 3 or 4 minute sections. You would buy a whole symphony in a cardboard booklet, a folder booklet that would contain a whole slew of singles that you had to play in order, and it would break up the symphony, and you can never hear it in continuous play. And so it was with some fanfare, in 1948, Columbia Records produced the first 12-inch, 33 1/3 RPM LP. And LP, of course, stood for long playing, because these were now long playing records, where they've developed micro grooves that they put on a vinyl disc instead of shellac. The shellac discs had very deep, wide grooves that were very noisy, and the micro grooves on the vinyl had much better sound quality, And now you can listen to an entire symphony on one album and just flip the side one time instead of going through the album of 10-inch 78 RPM records and changing them every 3 minutes. So now you got something that can last up to like 40 minutes for a typical album. And that's where the word album came from, was from those cardboard folder albums that contained all the 10-inch 78s. And we continued to call the single long-playing disc, vinyl disc, an album, because it's an album of songs, a collection of songs, a snapshot, if you will, of the band or artist at that point in time and space, to give you a good overall view of where they were at that time. But these long-playing albums were mostly for symphonies and long-playing pieces, and people who played singles were still happy with the 10-inch singles for a while, until in 1949 when RCA Victor introduced the very first 7-inch 45 RPM single, which again now uses the micro grooves in the vinyl disc. And these were easier to handle for disc jockeys and easier to carry around for kids who played the singles. But as time went by, more bands started creating albums with a collection of 10 to 12 songs that was a good portrait of the band at that time. And it's cool to compare different albums throughout a band's career to see their evolution and how they developed musically over the years. Also, some albums really did have concepts, like, of course, the first rock opera, Tommy by The Who, was a continuous piece of 2 record albums with one long story where all the songs fit in. And probably in a lot of progressive groups took it even further, like, of course, the ultimate concept album, The Dark Side of the Moon, my favorite album of all time by Pink Floyd, where the songs all fit together and tell a story of madness. And when bands did these concept albums, they would still be recording singles, 45 singles. And the fans would feel slighted, especially in England and Britain, when they would buy an album and find that there was a song that was already released as a single. And they would complain that they're paying for the same song twice. And so a lot of singles never made it onto albums, especially during the early to mid-'60s, throughout the 60s and the British invasion. And so a lot of singles were left by the wayside, and when albums became more popular and became the preferred form of music, recorded music, a lot of bands were able to go back and salvage a bunch of singles and release them as a collection of lost curios and lost songs, lost tracks, big hits that were never put on a long-playing album, and they could cash in on that too. Another advantage is that there's a bunch of hits that had never been collected on an album on one record, and this was advantageous to the fans too. Now, I know I started with singles myself. I'm an albums guy, but I started with singles back in the 60s, of course. My parents were young and listened to a lot of the early roots rock music and the British invasion stuff. And fortunately for me, my father worked for a vending company who replaced the singles on jukeboxes all throughout the Mahoning Valley here. And when he'd take the old singles off, they were supposed to just toss them in the dumpster. But of course, he was allowed to bring them home. They would look the other way. He would come home with boxes of singles, 45s, tens of thousands of them we've accumulated over the years, of every type of music. And I was exposed to all of these different types of musics through all these singles. And it was an invaluable learning experience for me in my musical development as a musician. So I'm grateful to be exposed for all of those singles. But I would notice that on many of the singles that I had, that I liked, by many different groups, I find that the B-side might be more interesting than the hit. Even though I love the hit song, like, let's say, Little Willie by Sweet. If you'd flip it over, there's a very heavy hard rock song called Man from Mecca, which blows away Little Willie, which was a bubblegum pop hit. The same with other bands, like the Grassroots. A great example, a band from Florida called Blues Image had a big hit, one-hit wonder, Ride, Captain Ride, in 1971. The flip side was an even better hard rock tune, Pay My Dues. But again and again, I find so many B-sides that were so much more interesting than the hit. And this made me curious about what other songs the bands had to offer. And so by the early 70s, I had totally given up on the singles and started buying record albums, starting with Black Sabbath Volume 4. And started my collection from there and found that this gave a much better overview of a band in their musical repertoire.
Hello, we are the Multiple Cat, and speaking of music, you're listening to it.
Of course, eventually, the 45 RPM single began to fade by the late 70s, and the LP was it. Yet still, the record companies tried to force singles from bands to pick a single that they could release for radio airplay mostly. And many times this could be difficult for the more progressive groups like Jethro Tull. Their Thick of the Brick album was one continuous song, which continued on side 1 to side 2. It was one long song. And so they had to edit out a certain portion of that tune to release it as a single within a 3 to 4 minute length. Most albums had some kind of a concept or something that held them all together. They kept the songs ran in a running order too. That is another important thing, is the running order of an album. The first song is usually a hit song or something that grabs you, something they would start the show with. The second and third songs are also usually possible single releases. Some of the best songs are always in the beginning of side 1, and side 2 should always open with a real strong piece too.
So I thought I'd stop it right there because he goes on for another 5 or 6 minutes, which I want to play, but he touched on something important about the running order of an album. You know, the bands and the producers and the managers, you know, there was thought that went into which song was the first song. Obviously, probably because they want the most powerful, hard-hitting song to be number one. Not always, but usually. But I know exactly what he means when he says a song in a particular order on the album has its place. And I remember that there was a common phenomenon. I couldn't write it out on paper. I don't know what words I would use. But the first song on side B of an album or a cassette, it was kind of like maybe the next best song sometimes. Or maybe it was the bone that the band would throw to the really hardcore artists would be the first song on side 2 or side B. And the other thing he said that was interesting, and I'll turn it over to you guys, is it's surprising to hear a guy like Jimmy who, you know, grew up in the 60s and 70s and played music, and his music knowledge is informed from that era. It's interesting to hear him talk about like the Jethro Tull record, where actually in that instance the music sort of suffered because they couldn't let the body of work play out as intended because of the limitation of the side A, side B. So that surprised me that he actually referenced, whether he knew that's what he was doing or not, but he actually cited an instance where, hey, nowadays you can put on your digital MP3 and you can listen to that whole Jethro Tull album, you know, continuously, or a live album, and there's not going to be any breaks that's going to sort of interrupt the flow and the fluidity of what was intended when that song was produced. So with all that being said, Lucas, do you have any thoughts on the subject or anything that stood out what Jimmy had to say?
Absolutely. And I don't know if it's because I am old and grew up listening to albums that I think about that still. You know, we just recorded a few weeks ago, and we thought very long and hard about how we're going to organize these, you know, on the CD or whatever. You know, I don't know if it matters to everyone nowadays, but I still definitely put a lot of thought into it because that's how I, you know, grew up listening to music. But I'm not sure, do people have an attention span for listening to something in its entirety anymore?
That's a good question.
You know, does it still matter? It matters to me,
mm-hmm.
But does it still matter to absolutely everyone? You know, has it just become, you know, because there isn't a physical copy of anything anymore and people can just go to whatever track they want to, does it matter? Are they ever going to sit down and listen to everything in its entirety? I'm not sure. But, you know, I think that dude is absolutely 100% correct. And, you know, the lineup of any piece of recorded music it's super important.
You could even take that a step farther and ask the question, in today's time, are people sitting down to listen to music as a sole event with nothing else going on?
That's a great question. I do.
I do.
I do, but does everyone else just listen to it like in passing in their car or exclusively through the tiny speaker on their phone? I'm not sure.
And we have so many options these days with just the internet era. There's just so many modes of entertainment. There's waiting, just sort of, dinging and ringing for you to press play, log on. But
even then, they were trying to grab everyone's attention and keep it. How they structured an album, where they want what songs they wanted to load up front. You're trying to catch their ear and keep it. And now I think you have even less time to grab someone's ear and keep it because, attention spans are so short. If you spent money on a thing, you're going to try and listen to that thing, I think. But now everything's pretty much free and you can go to YouTube and click on a song. And if you don't like it within 5 seconds, next. You're not invested in anything.
It's a disposable camera.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Rick?
Absolutely. You make a great point that myself coming up, late 90s, early 2000s, I witnessed the transition. Albums were still important and vital, and, some of the first albums I remember, really getting into, Radiohead's OK Computer, another great example of an album that is a flowing concept. But as the rise of digital technology, Napster was a game changer in so many ways, and even before iTunes, you're noticing because of Napster, because of Kazaa, because of file sharing, people are downloading individual songs. And when a new artist has a single on the radio, they're downloading the singles. So it kind of reverted back, I think at that point was the start of the rise of the singles again. Singles made a comeback over albums, and let's face it, how many albums have we all bought because we have heard a single or we have heard 1 or 2 tracks, we pick up the entire album and there's some clunkers on it. And really, anytime you're revisiting that album is because of the singles. I mean, I think everyone has a few of those in their collection. Mm-hmm. So the rise of digital media kind of became a solution to that. Well, and then eventually with iTunes and Rhapsody and streaming services, there was a fee where artists got a very small, but at least they got a cut now, and you can select what tracks you want. It's very interesting because the culture has flipped away. He had mentioned, Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick. One great long conceptual piece, but, you also take into consideration Michael Jackson's Thriller, which is an album, but pretty much every track on that album stands alone as a single.
Yeah.
So there's always been a correlation between more pop and artists that are a little deeper into their own genre, whether it be rock or country. Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings all had albums, longer conceptual pieces with, break apart singles. And obviously you think of 70s progressive rock, all that was conceptual, but there was always pop. There was always pop artists that radio stations and the major record companies were really pushing the singles. And the album, kind of took a back seat to the singles. So that's always kind of existed. I think the times have reverted more favorably to singles. The album still exists. There's still a lot of great artists putting out a lot of great albums. But the side A, side B mentality, I think, is changing. And you're seeing a lot of artists now putting out EPs, smaller pieces from the same. He mentioned also an album being sort of a photograph of one period in time for an artist, one particular period of creativity. And, the side A, side B aspect of it. Now artists are putting out 2 or 3 EPs, all from the same time period, all pretty much recorded together, but released separately, I guess easier to digest. But you kind of still have that mentality if that particular artist is approaching it from that aspect. Because EP1, then how's EP2 going to connect it but differ, and so on and so forth.
Lucas, if you were to find out that you had to move in 2 weeks and you started to pack your belongings, How important is that box that contains your cassettes and your vinyl and your CDs?
Oh, it's super important.
Super important.
I can tell you exactly where it is at any moment. You know, the albums are in a milk crate, and I know exactly where that milk, it's been moved dozens of times by now. And, you know, all the cassettes are in a shoebox, and, you know, I will hang on to that stuff probably until I die, or, you know, maybe if there's a house fire and it all burns to the ground. But, you know, I know exactly where that stuff is at any moment, and it's, you know, it always rides in the car, not the rental truck.
Is it possible to appreciate the convenience and the accessibility of digital music while still just having a half moment of silence for, you know, not being able to hold that old Pink Floyd Animals on vinyl and sit down with your son or your daughter someday and look at it and talk about what you were doing? Maybe there's something scribbled on the back of the vinyl, or maybe, you know, the CD's got a chip out of the jewel case. But regardless, it's something that will go with you when you move from home to home. And you can probably put it in a general category with heirlooms and personal memorabilia, sentimental things that you might keep in a firebox or a shoebox under your bed. And, you know, again, isn't it our right to at least recognize the fact that it's sort of sad that that's phasing out?
It's totally sad. First of all, nobody's ever going to break up a bag on a digital file. You know, you're never going to find seeds in the spine of an MP3. Just forget it. There's a lot of stuff that goes with that. Like, you know, the smell of, we all know the smell. You know, every one of those things had a smell. And if you picked up a used record, like it smelled like somebody else's house or their basement, or, you know, it had some weird feel to it that you just can't get from something that doesn't physically exist. And while I definitely enjoy being able to, you know, pull up a program on my phone, listen to absolutely anything from any time at any moment in seconds or less, you know, there's something to be said about producing something that is an actual physical piece with artwork and a weight to it. And, you know, I think that also goes hand in hand with sitting and listening to a record. You can actually like stare at the liner notes while you're doing it, or flip, you know, open up your folded up cassette insert and read through everything while you're listening to it. And I think that kind of contributed to, and, you know, maybe filled your attention a little bit more by interacting with something that was directly related to the piece of music that you're listening to, instead of, you know, just some data that floats through space that, you know, you can easily listen to something as just background music because you're not holding or looking at artwork or reading through the liner notes, or just, you know, wondering like what was going through these guys' heads when they recorded this. And, you know, that physical copy of something had something that was a little bit of a clue to that, that you just don't have anymore.
I don't know if this is the same for you. I'd imagine it would be. But sometimes when I go to my record collection, I pull out a particular record, it jumpstarts memories. Like, oh, this was
the seashell effect.
This was the soundtrack to the summer of 2005.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
this was when, you know, I accomplished X, Y, and Z in my life, or when I didn't accomplish X, Y, and Z in my life, and I was mopey.
Yeah, it can make or break something. You know, if you were going through a rough time when you were listening to something, as soon as you put that music on, like, you're immediately transported back to where you were feeling crappy, or you were going through, you know, a divorce or who knows what.
Do you think that same effect could be achieved? I'm asking both of you. Do you think that same effect could be achieved by, you know, scrolling through one of your playlists and listening to it digitally?
I think so. A lot of it probably depends on what you were doing. For example, there are a few albums that I listened to while I was working on a car. You know, I had this big project, and, you know, I took something with no motor and eventually drove it out of my garage. So I wasn't looking at the album artwork or paying much attention to. It was just on while I was doing it. And because I listened to it so much and I spent so much time there, that definitely applies. And some of those are things that, were downloads. Of course, I had to burn them to a CD because, we haven't always had the super handy technology we have now where your music can go with you absolutely anywhere and you don't need a physical copy of it. But yeah, I think that if you're listening to something and you're actually actively listening to it, you can transport that whole seashell effect with you, regardless of the physical copy or not.
So let's get back into Jimmy's comments on this, and I'm going to read something that he actually emailed to me after he submitted these recorded comments, and it sort of gives away his position on the comparison between album rock and cassette singles or just singles in general. But he says, having 20/20 hindsight, why would a band or artist rooted in today's iTunes mindset waste time composing or recording complex music or very unusual material that would take many listens to grow on you when that type of music is not compatible with the buy the song market? Abolishing LP albums forces bland cookie cutter music. And then he closes with a quote, if you're single-minded, you've got a one-track mind.
That's pretty good.
But let's get back into his comments on this.
The one thing that I love about albums is that sometimes the songs that at first didn't jump right out at you later on become some of my favorite songs. They have to grow on you. And those tunes would never click as singles. But not everything has to be designed to catch the listener's ear within just a few seconds. If the band has any real talent, it should be able to put together at least 10 or 12 worthwhile tunes. But there's so many really good songs that are so complex or maybe just unusual and different that it takes a few listens to really catch on to what the artist is saying here musically. And you would never get the opportunity to do that if you just had singles, because those songs would never be released as singles, and a lot of good music would fall by the wayside. And so I don't mind forcing myself to listen to a whole album of songs, whether on vinyl or a CD, that a band releases, so that I would play them over and over and keep listening to the ones that I didn't think were so good, and my preferences would change over time. This is an interesting concept and a good defense for albums. Of course, with the advent of the internet and iTunes, it pretty much squelched the whole music industry, and vinyl records are gone, CDs are disappearing now. It's all digital uploads and 99-cent iTunes by the song. I do not like buying music by the song. I always prefer to buy an album, a collection of songs. And it's absolutely wrong to cut up some songs, like stuff from Dark Side of the Moon, and sell one of those tracks, like Brain Damage, if you can buy that for 99 cents. It's just wrong. It does not fit by itself. It has to be with the rest of the concept album. And in fact, some bands like Pink Floyd demands that Dark Side of the Moon be sold in its entirety and will not allow iTunes or other places to sell one track from that album. And I commend them for this. And of course, there's something for having the physical product in your hands, which you don't get from digital downloads. But the artwork alone was so fantastic. From all those albums of the past, there were some really legendary covers, like bands like Yes, and their work with Roger Dean and all of his fantastic artwork. In fact, Roger Dean was able to release a few books which contained nothing but album cover artwork of all these fantastic portraits and paintings that he created for Yes. And so there was a lot of great artwork that you held in your hands, the physical product, and there were lyric sheets and photos of the band. It was truly an album still. And we lost that. It's gone, and that's very sad. Of course, we still can have it with the CDs, but it's not the same as the big vinyl albums. You got to have a magnifying glass sometimes just to read the credits. But that's sad that we lost the art that goes with the music. But I encourage bands and artists to think beyond more than one song. Try to think of a group of songs that would go together, that would represent where you're at that point in time. And here's an interesting bit of trivia pertaining to vinyl albums. It appears that every vinyl album ever created has the exact same numbers of grooves on it. And that answer is 2 grooves. There, on each side of the album, there is one continuous groove that spirals from the edge of the album in towards the center to the label. And this is the one single groove that the stylus rides all the way across the record. So there's one groove on each side of the album. Every album made has 2 grooves. And one more interesting bit, if that groove was straightened out, approximately, on the average album length, is 1,500 feet, or 1/3 of a mile, that spiral groove per side. Just an interesting piece of trivia there. Groovy, huh? Long live long-playing albums. Thank you.
When you listen to a new record by U2, track 6 and track 7 of the album is just track 6 and track 7. Whereas if you listen to Ozzy Osbourne, Blizzard of Oz, I think it was Mr. Crowley was the first song on side B. It was strategically slotted there because it's a strong song, and it sort of was the opening song of the second side. Whereas today, the playlist is just 12 songs.
Yeah.
So side B, the role of the side B in that opening track, for example, is just...
From an album.
Yeah, and even the 45, you could talk about that too, like how B-side sometimes was the place where you put a unreleased track, a rare track, or in the Beatles' case, side B was just as good as side A, from what I understand.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there was albums that all the songs on there were hits. Those were back in the days when you had supergroups, you know. But always loved the B-sides. In fact, the B-side was a notch down from the hit. And when I was playing in bands back in the day, we always picked the B-sides because the hits were always worn out. And the B-sides had yet to peak.
Right.
So we always thought, wow, we grab the B-side and then play the B-side, and, you know, maybe people will latch on to it and they'll just like it. They won't be burned out on it like they are the hit, you know. That's kind of a cool thing. Like you said, the Beatles albums, but then you kind of listen to that stuff and you go, well, was there a B-side for the day, you know? We listen to them now and we look, we're all like, you know, the Beatles were one of the greatest bands there ever was, you know, and so it's hard for them to do wrong in our eyes with anything, you know? Mm-hmm. But you kind of wonder if that was the B-side, if there were B-sides back in the day that people just said, I could care less about that. I watched the movie, that documentary, The Wrecking Crew. Okay. They were talking about Pet Sounds versus Sgt. Pepper's. Yeah. And they had said that Pet Sounds was superior, and I was like, how could that even be? I mean, I don't even know about that. I mean, it was a genius work of art, but yeah. I mean, there again, you know, I mean, we look at it from a perspective of, you know, how many years later, and it's like nothing touches that nowadays. So, no, I always thought the B-side was cool. In fact, some of those old albums you get on CD now, or you download them, you know, that you had, and you kind of remember that whole thing from having the album, you know? Right. And now you look at that, you know, it's just a list of songs, like you said, you know, and it's like that kind of effect is going, oh, man, I remember when I used to put the needle down, you know, and used to listen to that, and then, oh, man, I couldn't wait to hear that, you know. The order of the songs did make a big difference, you know.
It did, and there's nothing more nostalgic than the soft sounds of faint scratches on a record.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which, you know, it's kind of funny. I was working on a turntable here one day, and the way I test everything is to put it to use, and hopefully really good use, you know. And with a turntable, you have to check it from beginning to end because the tracking makes a big difference in how it's working and everything. The tone arm was like kind of weirding out. So after I fixed it, I took an album and actually just digitized it, took it and let it play all the way through on both sides. It was an album that I had wanted to convert over to digital. So I did that in the process, and just to listen to it digital. But then it was kind of funny, like what you're saying. You know, I heard the scratches in there, but it was kind of cool too at the same time, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like you capture the album totally, you know?
Right. It's like a seashell or a time capsule, and it helps you remember what you were doing back in that time.
Totally. And not only that, but the artwork too. Mm-hmm. The album artwork.
Notes.
Yeah. I remember when I went down in Hubbard, there's a place now, there's an accounting firm there right now. They had this place called the Talisman. It was like a head shop, but they had records too. And I bought Hotel California, the Eagles there. I remember when it first came out, man. I mean, and that's kind of a landmark album, you know. But yeah, I mean, like, just looking at that and, you know, the graphics on the album, obviously you can't fit that stuff on an MP3. Who really pays attention to, who really digs in and reads all that stuff? I mean, when you open up an album, it was like a book, you know?
Right.
And you had something physical to grab onto there, you know? Now it's just like this little window in your MP3 player, and who really wants to strain their eyes looking at that?
And you're less likely to look at the track titles in the listing. Like when you had vinyl, when you flipped it over to side B, you're going to look to check its side B, you know, and
Yep.
you're going to read the words, and they're more likely to be imprinted in your memory, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of hard to capture that now, you know? I mean, a lot of the generations now know nothing about that, but we got to experience it, you know, and it was just a cool thing. And then, you know, obviously there were generations before us that were experiencing LPs, you know, and then 45s too. I mean, 45s, there was a hit and usually a B-side there, you know, I mean, and usually the backside of the 45 ended up doing something.
Yep.
Because it was on there, and people were like, well, I got this, I got to listen to it, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of promoted what they were doing.
Yeah, and if it came out before an album, it was new stuff, so it was one more song that you got to sink your teeth into.
Yep. Those were the days, huh?
Yeah. Now, Nick, do you here at Tonetronics, do you do vinyl repair or record player repair?
Limited, only on real high-end stuff, you know. Like, I mean, you know, stuff that it would be cheaper to fix than it would to replace it,
Sure.
you know. I mean, I've got guys, as you can see right here, home audio stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, that's nice, huh? Macintosh amplifiers and preamps, you know. I mean, I'll work on that stuff because obviously, I mean, that amp right there's used is $3,500. You know, a lot of stuff nowadays is throwaway. But you do have guys that really want to keep some of the good old stuff going, you know.
Definitely. So our tagline for this new show is, speaking of music, you're listening to it. Would you want to do that? We'll put it in there sometime.
This is Nick from Tonetronics. Speaking of music, you're listening to it right now.
Thanks for calling the Speaking of Music show hotline. Leave your comments, your answers to our show questions after the beat. Thanks again.
As someone else pointed out, Kiss's biggest hit was on the B-side of Destroyer, which was Beth. Another one of their good ones, which is underrated, is Rocket Ride, which was on the B-side of Alive 2. Now, I always wondered why B-sides were looked at negatively. A lot of bands put out B-sides or unreleased stuff on separate albums. I always enjoyed them.
All right, very cool. You can read up more about Jimmy Taylor. His drum set was featured in Modern Drummer magazine, and I think along with the other artist, Mike Garrigan, who submitted some comments on this topic, we'll play a song where Jimmy played drums on. I believe it's Mellow Crash, or it might be the Jim Golan solo album, but we'll include a song at the end of this episode with Jimmy Taylor on drums, and then also a Mike Garrigan song. But Rick, thoughts?
Oh, I could pull a lot of great thoughts from that quote. I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning of what he said about the singles, about how, you know, the A side was the hit single, but the B side was usually so much more interesting. And, you know, and I think that actually goes back to kind of a corporate thing at the record company level. I mean, they kind of giving bands some leeway because, you know, you want to get that song that's going to reel as many people in as you can. It's all about numbers. It's all about selling. But the good thing about that, and why a lot of bands, a band like Sweet, who I'm actually a fan of, and who had some really awesome, you know, hard rock before hard rock as hard rock and heavy metal was really coming into its own in the early 70s. You know, they would put out these kind of more bubblegummy, radio-friendly things, but there's an opportunity to get what, you know, the really good stuff out there. So that's a really awesome thing that's unfortunately gone by the wayside. That is how you reel in new fans. You get the casual listener, they'll buy the single, they'll dig it, and there's money in everyone's pockets, everyone's happy. But for the people that want to dig deeper, there's a true reflection of what that band is really about.
Mm-hmm.
Then you may gravitate toward the album from there. And, he made a lot of great points about a lot of albums, particularly he's talked about Volume 4 by Black Sabbath, which was Change the only real single on that album?
It might have been, and that's my least favorite Black Sabbath song ever.
Did that one have Sabotage? Yeah. Or, I'm sorry, Supernaut.
Yes, it had Supernaut.
Okay.
Was that another single?
I don't remember them having a whole lot of
I remember hearing
singles.
that on WSRD.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Supernaut.
Well, he made a great point, because one of my favorite just songs of all time is Under the Sun.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that ever really working as a single. I mean, it's a little longer. I think it exceeds 6 minutes. And I mean, especially for the time, I mean, that is a dark, heavy song. That's something that, you hear a song like Change and you get an idea of, oh, maybe Sabbath's gone soft. But that album has some of their deepest, hardest cuts. And just the idea of the artwork, how he mentioned, I mean, I love picking up a Tool album and looking at the work they've done with Alex Gray. And, there's been some punk bands that I listened to from the late 90s that were on Epitaph Records that I look at some of the artwork, and they basically just had their friend at the local university from wherever they were from, putting out these, it's great. It fits the music. It gives you, having a visual, I think, is still important. And I also think, the idea that the music video now is so, I mean, it always was a, part of a corporate thing, I guess, but it's so devalued anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, there's so much great stuff that exists on YouTube, but how would you ever know unless you're really digging for it?
Yeah, and I just want to add that, once again, we don't want to come across as old fogies or just resisting, the new wave of digital media, because it is accessible and you can listen to a whole lot more in a shorter amount of time. It's great for taking it wherever you go. If you go to a party, you go camping, on a road trip, you bring